Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today's new story is The Untold Story of Priscilla and Aquila, the couple Paul couldn't afford to lose. Please support the channel with a like and subscribe. The content of this video has been carefully compiled from various sources, so if there are any missing details or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your additional insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story.
For most Christians, the story of the early church is told through famous names: Peter, Paul, James, men whose sermons, journeys, and sacrifices helped shape the course of history. But hidden behind many of those stories is a couple that most people barely remember. They never wrote a book of the Bible. They never led thousands in a public revival. They never held the titles that history usually celebrates. Yet, again and again, whenever the Christian movement reached a critical turning point, their names appeared. Priscilla and Aquila, a Jewish husband and wife, forced from their home by the Roman Empire. Refugees who became missionaries, tent makers who became teachers, ordinary believers who quietly influenced apostles, trained leaders, opened their home to churches, and helped spread a faith that would eventually reach the ends of the Roman world. So, who were they, really? Why did the Apostle Paul speak of them with such extraordinary respect? Why does Priscilla's name sometimes appear before her husband's? Something highly unusual in the ancient world. And how did a couple with no recorded sermons and no surviving writings leave a legacy that still echoes nearly 2,000 years later? To answer those questions, we must travel back to the crowded streets of Imperial Rome, where an unexpected crisis would set in motion one of the most remarkable and overlooked stories in the history of early Christianity. The story of early Christianity is often told through the lives of extraordinary individuals. Readers of the New Testament encounter apostles crossing seas, confronting authorities, preaching before crowds, and carrying the message of Jesus into regions that had never heard his name. Figures such as Peter, Paul, and James naturally occupy a prominent place in this narrative, because the surviving sources preserve much of their work and leadership. Yet, one of the most important realities of ancient history is that movements are rarely built by famous leaders alone. Behind every visible achievement stands a network of people whose contributions are less documented, but no less significant. The rise of the early church was no exception. Among the many individuals who helped shape its development, few are more intriguing than Priscilla and Aquila. Unlike Paul, they left no surviving letters. Unlike Peter, they are never portrayed delivering major public speeches. Unlike James, they did not oversee a central congregation whose decisions affected the entire movement. In fact, the New Testament provides only scattered references to their lives. Yet, those references appear at remarkably strategic moments. Each time Priscilla and Aquila enter the biblical narrative, they are connected to an important stage in the growth of Christianity. They appear during Paul's ministry in Corinth. They participate in the development of the church in Ephesus. They help instruct Apollos, one of the most capable teachers mentioned in the Book of Acts. Their home becomes a gathering place for believers. Their names appear repeatedly in Paul's letters, taken individually. These references may seem modest. Viewed together, they reveal a pattern that deserves closer examination. Before exploring their story, however, it is important to understand what makes them historically interesting. Many secondary figures appear briefly in ancient literature and then disappear. Priscilla and Aquila are different because their movements can be traced across several of the most important cities in the Roman world. Their lives intersect with major developments occurring within the first generation of Christian history. Through them, we gain a unique perspective on how the early church actually functioned beyond the activities of its most famous leaders. Their story allows us to move from public preaching into private homes, from missionary journeys into everyday labor, and from theological debates into personal relationships that helped sustain Christian communities. One reason historians pay particular attention to Priscilla and Aquila is that they illustrate the interconnected nature of the first-century Mediterranean world. The Roman Empire stretched across vast distances, yet trade routes, roads, ports, and urban centers created networks that connected diverse populations. Ideas, goods, and people moved through these networks constantly. Christianity spread through the same channels. As we follow the journey of Priscilla and Aquila, we encounter some of the empire's most influential cities, including Rome, Corinth, and Ephesus. Their story, therefore, becomes more than a biography. It becomes a window into the social, economic, and religious environment that allowed Christianity to expand from a small movement in Judea into a faith reaching across the Mediterranean basin. The biblical sources also reveal another notable characteristic. Priscilla and Aquila almost always appear together. This is not entirely unique within the New Testament, but it is unusual in its consistency. Whether they are traveling, working, hosting believers, or assisting Christian leaders, they function as a partnership. The texts never attempt to separate their contributions into competing categories. Instead, they present a husband and wife participating together in the mission of the early church. This feature of the narrative has attracted scholarly interest because it provides one of the clearest examples of a married couple actively involved in Christian ministry during the first century. At the same time, many questions remain unanswered. We do not know precisely when they became followers of Jesus. The New Testament never records their conversion. We do not know whether they encountered Christianity in Rome, Corinth, or elsewhere. We know that Aquila was originally from Pontus, a region along the southern coast of the Black Sea, but the details of his early life remain unknown. Likewise, the background of Priscilla is largely hidden from history. These gaps remind us that responsible historical study must distinguish between evidence and speculation. The goal is not to fill every silence with imagination, but to understand as much as possible from the sources that actually exist. Fortunately, the surviving evidence is more substantial than it first appears. Across the Book of Acts and several Pauline letters, enough information survives to reconstruct the broad outline of their lives. We can trace their movements. We can identify their relationships with key figures. We can observe the roles they played within Christian communities. Most importantly, we can evaluate why Paul regarded them so highly. This last point is particularly significant. Throughout his letters, Paul reserves special language for a relatively small number of co-workers. Priscilla and Aquila belong within that group. His comments suggest that they were not casual acquaintances, but trusted partners whose contributions had lasting importance. As their story unfolds, we will encounter exile, migration, commerce, teaching, hospitality, and sacrifice. We will see how political decisions made in Rome affected lives hundreds of miles away. We will explore the realities of urban life within the Roman Empire and the challenges facing the first generation of Christians. We will examine what the sources tell us, what they leave uncertain, and why this couple continued to be remembered long after their own lifetime. The journey begins not in a church building or a missionary outpost, but in the capital of the Roman Empire itself. There, a political decision issued by an emperor would unexpectedly alter the course of their lives and place them on a path that would eventually intersect with some of the most important developments in early Christian history. Before Priscilla and Aquila became associated with Corinth, Ephesus, or the ministry of Paul, Their story was rooted in the city that stood at the center of the ancient world. Rome was not simply the capital of an empire. During the 1st century, it was the political, economic, and administrative heart of a territory stretching from Britain to North Africa and from the Atlantic coast to the Near East. Hundreds of thousands of people lived within the city. Merchants arrived from distant provinces. Soldiers returned from military campaigns. Officials administered imperial affairs. Religious traditions from across the Mediterranean existed side by side. For ambitious individuals, Rome offered opportunity. For immigrants, it offered possibility. For many Jews living within the empire, it became an important center of community life. It was within this environment that Priscilla and Aquila were living before the events recorded in the Book of Acts. Although the New Testament provides only limited details about their early years, Acts 18 identifies Aquila as a Jew, originally from Pontus, a region located along the southern coast of the Black Sea in Asia Minor. At some point, he and Priscilla were living in Rome as part of the city's substantial Jewish population. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of Jews may have resided there during the 1st century. They maintained synagogues, participated in commerce, preserved their religious traditions, and formed communities that connected them to fellow Jews throughout the empire. The existence of these networks helps explain why people could relocate from one region to another while still finding social and economic support. Yet life in Rome was never entirely predictable. Political decisions made by emperors could dramatically affect entire populations. This reality became especially important during the reign of Emperor Claudius, who ruled from AD 41 to AD 54. Claudius is often remembered as a capable administrator who expanded Roman influence and strengthened imperial governance. However, like many Roman rulers, he was also concerned with maintaining public order. When disturbances emerged within the capital, the government frequently intervened. According to Acts 18, one such intervention directly affected Priscilla and Aquila. Luke records that Paul met Aquila, who had recently come from Italy with Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. This brief statement is one of the most important historical details associated with their story, because it connects the biblical narrative to evidence preserved outside the New Testament. Several ancient Roman writers mention actions taken by Claudius involving the Jewish population. The most frequently discussed source comes from the Roman historian Suetonius, who wrote that Claudius expelled Jews from Rome because of disturbances associated with someone called Chrestus. The exact meaning of this statement has been debated for generations. Some scholars argue that Chrestus may have been a misunderstanding or alternative spelling connected to Christ. If this interpretation is correct, the disturbances may have resulted from disputes within Jewish communities regarding the claims being made about Jesus as the Messiah. Others caution that the evidence is too limited to support firm conclusions. They note that Suetonius wrote decades later and provided few details about the events he described. Because of these uncertainties, historians generally approach the question carefully. What can be stated with reasonable confidence is that tensions existed within portions of Rome's Jewish population, and that Claudius responded in some manner that affected Jewish residents, including Priscilla and Aquila. For modern readers, it is easy to treat this event as a historical footnote for Priscilla and Aquila. However, it represented a profound disruption. The order forced them to leave the city where they had established their lives, whether they owned property, operated a business, maintained family connections, or participated in synagogue networks. All of those realities would have been affected. Exile in the ancient world was not a minor inconvenience. Relocation required resources, planning, and resilience. Travel involved both financial cost and physical risk. Individuals leaving a major urban center often faced uncertainty regarding employment, housing, and community support in their destination. Priscilla and Aquila suddenly found themselves navigating exactly these challenges. Yet this moment also illustrates a recurring theme visible throughout both biblical and secular history. Major historical developments are often shaped by events that appear unrelated at the time. Political decisions made in imperial capitals can produce consequences far beyond their original purpose. Claudius likely issued his order to address local concerns within Rome. There is no indication that he had any awareness of the future significance of Priscilla and Aquila. Nevertheless, his decision set into motion a chain of events that would ultimately connect this displaced Jewish couple to some of the most important figures and communities of early Christianity. Their departure from Rome also highlights the remarkable mobility of the Roman world. Although the empire was vast, roads, shipping routes, and commercial networks linked distant regions together. Merchants, craftsmen, travelers, soldiers, and migrants regularly moved between major cities. This interconnected environment played a crucial role in the spread of Christianity. Ideas traveled along the same routes used by commerce and migration. In the coming chapters, Priscilla and Aquila will move through several of these urban centers, becoming part of a larger network that connected Rome, Greece, and Asia Minor. Their journey begins with forced displacement, but it unfolds within a world where movement itself could create unexpected opportunities. At the time, however, none of this would have been obvious. Priscilla and Aquila were not looking at their situation through the lens of history. They were a married couple facing uncertainty after being uprooted from their home, like countless others throughout the ancient world. They needed to find stability, work, and community in a new place. Their destination would be Corinth, one of the most dynamic cities in the eastern Mediterranean. There, amid the noise of commerce and the constant flow of travelers, they would encounter a fellow tentmaker whose arrival would permanently alter the course of their lives. That meeting would transform a story of displacement into a story of partnership, mission, and lasting influence within the early church. When Priscilla and Aquila left Rome, they entered a world shaped by movement. Across the Roman Empire, people traveled constantly in search of trade, employment, opportunity, and security. Roads connected inland provinces to major urban centers. Shipping routes linked ports across the Mediterranean Sea. Merchants transported goods, officials carried imperial directives, and migrants relocated in response to political and economic pressures. Priscilla and Aquila were now part of this wider pattern. Forced to leave the capital, they made their way to Corinth, a city that stood at one of the most important crossroads in the eastern Mediterranean. If Rome represented political power, Corinth represented commercial energy. Rebuilt by Julius Caesar after its earlier destruction, the city had become one of the most prosperous urban centers in Greece. Its location gave it enormous strategic value. Situated near the narrow isthmus connecting northern and southern Greece, Corinth benefited from trade flowing between east and west. Ships arriving from different parts of the Mediterranean could avoid a dangerous voyage around the southern coast by transferring goods across the isthmus. As a result, merchants, sailors, travelers, craftsmen, and entrepreneurs constantly passed through the city. Wealth accumulated rapidly. But so did cultural diversity. Languages, religions, philosophies, and customs from across the Roman world converged in Corinth's streets. It was exactly the kind of place where new ideas could spread quickly. For Priscilla and Aquila, however, the immediate concern was not religious influence, it was survival. Like most displaced people throughout history, they needed to establish economic stability before anything else. Fortunately, they possessed a valuable skill. The Book of Acts indicates that they worked in the trade commonly translated as tent-making. Although modern readers often imagine simple canvas tents, the reality was likely broader. Scholars generally understand the profession to include the manufacture and repair of leather products, woven materials, protective coverings, awnings, travel shelters, and related goods used throughout the Roman economy. Such work was especially valuable in a commercial city where merchants and travelers constantly required durable equipment. Skilled craftsmen could build reliable businesses and develop extensive networks of clients and contacts. It was within this environment that one of the most significant encounters in early Christian history occurred. Acts 18 records that Paul arrived in Corinth and met Aquila and Priscilla because they shared the same trade. At first glance, the detail seems practical rather than theological. Paul needed work. They practiced the same profession. As a result, they lived and worked together. Yet this seemingly ordinary circumstance reveals something important about the realities of the first-century Christian movement. Modern readers sometimes imagine apostles functioning primarily as full-time religious leaders. In reality, Paul frequently supported himself through manual labor. His ministry was deeply connected to everyday economic life. He preached in synagogues and public settings, but he also spent long hours engaged in skilled work. The workshop was part of his mission field, not separate from it. This context helps explain why the relationship between Paul, Priscilla, and Aquila became so significant. Their partnership did not begin through formal appointment or institutional structure. It emerged through daily interaction. They shared labor, conversation, meals, and the practical challenges of life in a busy commercial city. The New Testament does not preserve those conversations, and responsible historical analysis should resist the temptation to invent them. Yet, the outcome is unmistakable. Over time, a simple professional connection developed into one of the most important ministry partnerships described in Acts. Paul remained in Corinth for an extended period, approximately 18 months, according to Luke's account. This was one of the longer stays recorded during his missionary journeys. During that time, the Christian community in Corinth began to take shape. New believers emerged from both Jewish and Gentile backgrounds. Opposition appeared in some quarters, while acceptance emerged in others. The city became an important center of Christian activity. Throughout this process, Priscilla and Aquila were present. Although Luke focuses primarily on Paul's ministry, the later evidence found in Paul's letters makes it clear that this couple was becoming increasingly important within the developing Christian network. Their role during these months likely extended beyond economic cooperation. The workshop itself would have occupied a central place in daily life. In the ancient world, workshops were often social environments where information circulated, relationships developed, and ideas were exchanged. Business and community frequently overlapped. Customers visited regularly. Travelers shared news from other regions. Discussions could continue throughout the workday. Within such a setting, Priscilla and Aquila gained first-hand exposure to Paul's teaching, missionary strategy, and understanding of the gospel. Corinth effectively became a period of formation for them. The significance of this stage becomes even clearer when viewed from a historical perspective. Before arriving in Corinth, Priscilla and Aquila were displaced Jewish migrants attempting to rebuild their lives after expulsion from Rome. By the time their stay in Corinth ended, they had become trusted associates of one of Christianity's most influential missionaries. The transformation did not occur through a dramatic single event. It emerged gradually through faithfulness, work, learning, and shared experience. This pattern is important because it reflects the way many relationships developed within the early church. Christian communities were not sustained solely through public preaching. They were strengthened through long-term personal connections built over time. Corinth also served as the place where Priscilla and Aquila began moving beyond the role of recipients toward the role of contributors. They were no longer simply adapting to circumstances imposed upon them. They were becoming active participants in a growing movement that extended far beyond any single city. The skills, relationships, and experiences acquired in Corinth would prepare them for responsibilities they could not yet foresee. Soon, they would leave the city alongside Paul and travel toward Ephesus, one of the most influential urban centers in Asia Minor. There, the lessons learned in Corinth would be tested on an even larger stage. The displaced couple who had arrived seeking stability was gradually becoming something far more significant. They were becoming trusted co-workers within a mission that stretched across the Roman world. By the end of their time in Corinth, Priscilla and Aquila had become far more than displaced immigrants rebuilding their lives after exile. They had become trusted associates of Paul and active participants in the expanding Christian movement. Yet, one of the most distinctive aspects of their story has little to do with a specific city, a particular sermon, or a dramatic historical event. It concerns the way they consistently appear together throughout the New Testament, in a narrative filled with individual apostles, evangelists, prophets, and teachers. Priscilla and Aquila stand out as a husband and wife whose ministry remained closely intertwined. Understanding the significance of this partnership requires examining both the biblical evidence and the social realities of the first-century world in which they lived. Marriage occupied a central place in both Jewish and Roman society, but the structure and expectations surrounding family life were often different from modern assumptions. In Roman culture, the household functioned as the basic unit of social organization. Economic activity, family relationships, education, and religious practices frequently revolved around the home. The head of the household generally held legal authority, while family members contributed to the functioning and prosperity of the household in various ways. Among Jewish communities scattered throughout the Roman Empire, family identity was equally important. Households served not only economic purposes but also helped preserve religious traditions, cultural practices, and communal stability. Against this backdrop, the New Testament presents Priscilla and Aquila as a couple whose shared faith became one of the defining features of their household. One reason scholars find them so interesting is the consistency with which they appear together. In Acts and Paul's letters, their names are repeatedly linked, whether relocating after their expulsion from Rome, working alongside Paul in Corinth, traveling to Ephesus, instructing Apollos, or hosting believers in their home. They function as a partnership. The sources never portray them pursuing separate ministries in different locations. Instead, their contribution to the early church emerges through collaboration. This does not mean they necessarily performed identical tasks or held identical responsibilities. The surviving evidence is simply too limited to support such detailed conclusions. What can be observed with confidence is that the biblical writers repeatedly present them as a united team participating in the mission of the gospel. This feature becomes even more noteworthy when compared to other married couples mentioned in the New Testament. Surprisingly few husband and wife partnerships receive significant attention in the biblical narrative. Many individuals appear independently, but relatively few couples are shown working together across multiple locations and ministry contexts. Priscilla and Aquila, therefore, provide one of the clearest examples of a Christian marriage actively engaged in the life of the early church. Their story offers valuable insight into how households contributed to the spread of Christianity during its earliest generations. The importance of their partnership becomes clearer when we consider the challenges they faced. Their lives had already been marked by disruption. They experienced forced relocation under Claudius. They rebuilt their economic stability in Corinth. They adapted to new environments and new opportunities. Throughout these transitions, the New Testament presents them moving forward together. Such resilience would have been difficult to sustain without a strong foundation of mutual trust and shared purpose. Historical studies of migration in the ancient world consistently show that successful adaptation often depended upon family cooperation and social support networks. In this respect, Priscilla and Aquila fit a broader historical pattern. Their partnership provided stability during periods of uncertainty and enabled them to participate more effectively in the opportunities that followed. Another important aspect of their story is the way Paul describes them. In Romans 16, he refers to them as his fellow workers in Christ Jesus. The phrase is significant because it places them within a relatively select group of individuals whom Paul regarded as active collaborators in ministry. He does not distinguish between one spouse as the primary contributor and the other as merely present. Instead, he acknowledges them together. This language reflects the impression consistently created throughout the New Testament. Priscilla and Aquila were not simply accompanying events occurring around them. They were engaged participants whose efforts contributed meaningfully to the development of Christian communities. It is also important to recognize what the biblical text does not do. The New Testament never romanticizes their marriage or presents an idealized portrait filled with personal details. We are not told how they met, how long they had been married, or what their daily family life looked like. The focus remains firmly on their role within the broader story of the early church. This restraint is valuable because it prevents later readers from projecting assumptions onto the narrative. Rather than constructing an idealized image based on speculation, we are left with a portrait grounded in observable actions. They traveled together. They worked together. They served together. They taught together. These are the elements the sources emphasize, and they provide sufficient evidence to understand why their partnership attracted attention within the early Christian movement. Their example also illustrates an important characteristic of Christianity's expansion during the first century. The gospel spread not only through individual missionaries, but through households committed to supporting the mission. Families could provide economic resources, hospitality, stability, and relational networks that strengthened local congregations. Priscilla and Aquila represent one of the clearest examples of this dynamic. Their marriage became a platform through which they could contribute to the work of the church across multiple cities and circumstances. By the time their stay in Corinth was drawing to a close, they had already demonstrated loyalty, adaptability, and spiritual maturity. Yet the most influential chapter of their ministry had not yet begun. A new opportunity was emerging beyond Greece, in one of the largest and most important cities of Asia Minor. Paul was preparing to continue his journey, and Priscilla and Aquila would soon accompany him. The skills they had developed in Corinth, the relationships they had formed, and the partnership they had strengthened would all prove essential in the next stage of their story. Ahead lay Ephesus, a city whose strategic importance would make it one of the great centers of early Christianity and the setting for some of the most significant events in their lives. After spending a lengthy and productive period in Corinth, Paul eventually prepared to continue his missionary work beyond Greece. The Christian community there had become firmly established. New believers had emerged from different backgrounds. Local congregations had begun to form, and the gospel had secured a lasting foothold within one of the most important cities of the region. Yet the strategy that characterized Paul's ministry rarely involved remaining in a single location indefinitely. His focus was often directed toward major urban centers where ideas, commerce, and people converged. From those cities, Christian communities could influence surrounding regions. It was a strategy shaped by the geography and infrastructure of the Roman Empire, and it would soon bring Priscilla and Aquila into a new phase of their journey. According to Acts 18, when Paul departed from Corinth, Priscilla and Aquila accompanied him. This detail deserves careful attention because it marks a significant transition in their story. Up to this point, they had primarily been associated with Corinth, the city where they rebuilt their lives after being expelled from Rome and where they first encountered Paul. Now they were leaving once again. The decision reflects a pattern that had already become visible throughout their lives. Rather than clinging to stability whenever it appeared, they repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. This flexibility would become one of the defining characteristics of their ministry. The journey itself followed routes that connected some of the most important regions of the Mediterranean world. Travel during the 1st century was challenging, but the Roman Empire possessed an impressive transportation network for its time. Roads linked inland cities, while maritime routes connected major ports across vast distances. Although travel remained expensive and often dangerous, these networks allowed merchants, officials, craftsmen, teachers, and religious movements to move between regions with a degree of efficiency that would have been impossible in many earlier periods of history. Christianity expanded within this interconnected environment. The same sea lanes that carried commercial goods also carried missionaries, letters, and ideas. Priscilla and Aquila were now participants in that larger movement. Their destination was Ephesus, a city whose importance within the Roman East can hardly be overstated. Located on the western coast of Asia Minor, Ephesus stood among the largest and most influential cities in the empire. It served as a major commercial center, connecting maritime trade routes with inland transportation networks. Wealth flowed through its markets. Travelers arrived from multiple provinces. Political authority, economic activity, and cultural exchange converged within its boundaries. The city was also famous for the Temple of Artemis, one of the most celebrated religious sites of the ancient world. As a result, Ephesus occupied a unique position where commerce, religion, and regional influence intersected. For a movement seeking to spread throughout Asia Minor, few locations could have been more strategically significant. Acts records that Paul arrived in Ephesus and entered the local synagogue, where he engaged in discussions with members of the Jewish community. The response appears to have been encouraging. Unlike some earlier encounters, the listeners requested that Paul remain longer. Yet he declined, indicating that he intended to continue his travels. Before leaving, however, he made a decision that reveals much about his confidence in Priscilla and Aquila. Rather than taking them with him to his next destination, he left them behind in Ephesus. This is one of the most revealing moments in their entire story. Ephesus was not an unimportant outpost on the edge of the empire. It was a major urban center whose future significance for Christianity would become enormous. Leaving trusted co-workers there implied more than simple convenience. It suggests that Paul regarded Priscilla and Aquila as capable individuals who could contribute meaningfully to the development of the Christian community in his absence. The New Testament does not describe a formal appointment or official position. Such details are absent from the text. What it does reveal is a practical reality. Paul entrusted them with continued involvement in one of the most strategically important cities he visited. This level of trust had likely been earned through years of shared experience in Corinth. Their reliability, judgment, and commitment had already been tested under difficult circumstances. Ephesus provided an opportunity for those qualities to be exercised on a larger stage. It is also worth noting that this period marks an important shift in the narrative. In Corinth, Priscilla and Aquila are often seen alongside Paul as they learn, work, and participate in the development of a local Christian community. In Ephesus, they begin to emerge more clearly as influential figures in their own right. Paul remains important to the story, but he is no longer physically present for every event. The focus gradually widens to include the independent contribution of the couple themselves. This transition is subtle, yet it plays a crucial role in understanding their legacy. They were not merely companions traveling in the shadow of a famous apostle. They were becoming respected participants in the broader mission of the church. Historically, Ephesus would prove to be one of the most significant centers of Christianity during the 1st century. Several New Testament writings are connected directly or indirectly to the city. Christian leaders would emerge there. Churches throughout the surrounding region would develop through its influence. Future generations would remember Ephesus as one of the major centers of early Christian life. Priscilla and Aquila arrived before much of this growth occurred. In a sense, they were present during the formative stages of a community that would later become highly influential, yet they could not have known what the future would bring. From their perspective, they were once again adapting to a new city, building relationships, and continuing the work that had become central to their lives. Soon, however, an unexpected encounter would place them at the center of one of the most fascinating episodes in the Book of Acts. A highly educated teacher from Alexandria would arrive in Ephesus. He possessed remarkable knowledge of the Scriptures, exceptional speaking ability, and sincere devotion to God. Yet his understanding of the gospel remained incomplete. The way Priscilla and Aquila responded to that situation would reveal not only the depth of their own understanding, but also the wisdom that made them such valuable contributors to the early Christian movement. After arriving in Ephesus, Priscilla and Aquila entered a city that occupied a strategic position within both the Roman Empire and the developing Christian movement. Ephesus was a place where trade routes converged. Travelers exchanged information, and new ideas circulated rapidly. It was also a city where religious diversity flourished. Traditional Greco-Roman worship, local cults, philosophical schools, Jewish communities, and emerging Christian groups all existed within the same urban environment. In such a setting, questions about truth, authority, and religious identity were frequently debated. It was here that Priscilla and Aquila would become involved in one of the most illuminating episodes recorded about them in the New Testament. The central figure in this episode was a man named Apollos. Luke introduces him in Acts 18 with a description that immediately captures attention. Apollos was a Jew from Alexandria. To readers in the ancient world, that detail alone carried significant weight. Alexandria, located in Egypt, was one of the great intellectual centers of the Mediterranean region, founded by Alexander the Great and developed under the Ptolemies. The city housed a large Jewish population and became famous for scholarship, education, and the study of sacred texts. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, known as the Septuagint, had emerged from this environment. Jewish intellectual traditions flourished there, producing influential thinkers and interpreters whose work shaped religious discussions throughout the diaspora. By identifying Apollos as an Alexandrian Jew, Luke signals that this was a man shaped by a culture of learning and scriptural study. The description becomes even more impressive as the narrative continues. Luke states that Apollos was eloquent and mighty in the Scriptures. These are not casual compliments. They suggest a person with exceptional knowledge of the Hebrew Bible and unusual skill in communicating that knowledge to others. In the ancient world, public speaking carried enormous importance. Teachers, philosophers, lawyers, and religious leaders often gained influence through their ability to persuade audiences. Apollos appears to have possessed exactly that kind of talent. He understood the Scriptures deeply, spoke effectively, and demonstrated genuine enthusiasm for the things of God. From a human perspective, he already seemed equipped to become an influential religious leader. Yet, Luke introduces a critical qualification. Although Apollos taught accurately concerning Jesus, his understanding remained incomplete. Acts explains that he knew only the baptism of John. This brief statement has generated considerable discussion among biblical scholars because Luke does not fully explain what information Apollos possessed and what information he lacked. Most interpretations agree on several key points. Apollos was not hostile to Christianity. He was not intentionally spreading false teaching. He possessed genuine knowledge and sincere conviction. At the same time, he had not yet received the full apostolic understanding of Jesus that had developed through the experiences of the early church following the resurrection, Pentecost, and the missionary work of leaders such as Paul. In other words, Apollos was knowledgeable, but not yet fully informed. This distinction is important because it shapes the way Priscilla and Aquila responded to him. The episode begins when they hear him speaking boldly in the synagogue. The scene is easy to imagine. Before a Jewish audience stands a gifted speaker from Alexandria, demonstrating impressive mastery of Scripture and passionately teaching what he understands about Jesus. Many listeners would likely have been impressed. Some may have assumed that such a knowledgeable teacher required no further instruction. Yet Priscilla and Aquila recognized that his understanding was incomplete. At this point, the narrative reveals something remarkable about their character. They did not challenge him publicly. They did not attempt to embarrass him before the congregation. They did not use the opportunity to display their own knowledge. Instead, Acts states that they took him aside and explained the way of God more accurately. These few words provide one of the clearest examples of wise discipleship found anywhere in the Book of Acts. Their approach demonstrates several qualities that are often difficult to combine. First, they possessed discernment. They recognized both the strengths and limitations of Apollos' teaching. Second, they demonstrated humility. Their goal was not personal recognition, but the growth of another believer. Third, they exercised patience, rather than turning a potential disagreement into a public controversy. They chose a setting that encouraged learning and mutual respect. In many ways, their response reflects the broader spirit of Christian discipleship described throughout the New Testament. Correction was not intended to humiliate, but to strengthen. Instruction was not about winning arguments, but about helping others understand truth more fully. This episode also provides one of the strongest indications of the significant role Priscilla herself played within the early Christian movement. Luke specifically names both Priscilla and Aquila as participants in the instruction of Apollos. The text does not isolate the conversation as Aquila's contribution alone. Instead, both members of the couple are presented as actively involved. This observation has attracted considerable scholarly attention because it offers direct evidence that Priscilla participated in an important act of theological instruction within the early church, while scholars continue to debate broader questions related to ministry roles in the first century. The narrative itself is clear on one point. Luke regarded both Priscilla and Aquila as contributors to Apollos' growth and development. The outcome of their interaction proved significant. After receiving additional instruction, Apollos continued his ministry with greater effectiveness. Acts records that he traveled to Achaia, where he became a powerful advocate for the Christian message. Using the Scriptures, he demonstrated that Jesus was the Messiah. Later references in the New Testament indicate that Apollos became widely respected among Christian communities. In 1 Corinthians, his name appears alongside Paul's as one of the most prominent teachers known to the church. This does not mean that Priscilla and Aquila created Apollos' abilities. His education, intelligence, and dedication already existed. What they provided was clarification at a crucial moment, helping a gifted teacher move from partial understanding to fuller comprehension. Historically, this episode reveals an important dimension of how Christian knowledge spread during the first century. The growth of the church depended not only on public preaching, but also on personal instruction. Ideas were transmitted through relationships. Leaders were developed through mentoring. Knowledge advanced through conversations that often occurred away from public attention. The encounter between Priscilla, Aquila, and Apollos offers a rare glimpse into that process. It shows how mature believers helped strengthen emerging leaders, and how the Christian movement preserved doctrinal continuity while expanding into new regions. More importantly, it demonstrates that influence within the early church was not measured solely by visibility. One private conversation in Ephesus helped shape the ministry of a man who would later become one of the most respected teachers of his generation. Through wisdom, humility, and careful instruction, Priscilla and Aquila contributed to the future of the Christian movement in a way that far exceeded the brief amount of space devoted to them in the biblical text. Their actions earned no public acclaim within the narrative, but they revealed a level of maturity that helps explain why they were so highly valued by Paul and by the communities they served. After examining the role Priscilla and Aquila played in the instruction of Apollos, we encounter one of the most intriguing details associated with their story. It is not a miracle, a missionary journey, or a dramatic confrontation. Instead, it is a literary detail that appears within the biblical text itself. In several passages, Priscilla's name appears before Aquila's. At first glance, this may seem insignificant. Modern readers rarely attach much importance to the order in which names are listed in the ancient world. However, name order could sometimes carry social, rhetorical, or contextual significance. As a result, this recurring pattern has attracted the attention of biblical scholars for generations. The discussion is fascinating, not because it provides definitive answers, but because it offers a glimpse into how historians and scholars approach small textual details when reconstructing the world of the New Testament. The first thing to recognize is that the pattern is real. In some passages, the couple is mentioned as Aquila and Priscilla. In others, the order is reversed. For example, Acts 18 initially introduces Aquila before Priscilla when describing Paul's first encounter with them in Corinth. Later references, including portions of Acts and several Pauline greetings, place Priscilla first. The variation is not universal, but it occurs often enough that it cannot simply be dismissed as a random accident. The question is whether the pattern carries meaning, and, if so, what that meaning might be. The honest answer is that no interpretation can be established with certainty. The New Testament never explains the reason directly. This limitation is important because responsible historical analysis must distinguish between evidence and speculation. Scholars can propose possibilities based on cultural context and textual patterns, but none of those possibilities should be presented as proven fact. The evidence invites discussion rather than definitive conclusions. One of the most common explanations concerns social standing. Some researchers have suggested that Priscilla may have come from a family of higher status than Aquila. The formal version of her name, Prisca, was known within Roman society and appears in inscriptions connected to prominent families. This observation has led some scholars to speculate that she may have possessed social connections or family background that gave her particular visibility within certain contexts. The theory is possible, but it remains unproven. The New Testament provides no direct information about her social status, family lineage, or economic background. Therefore, while the idea is plausible, it cannot be treated as established history. A second explanation focuses on ministry involvement. By the time Priscilla and Aquila appear in Ephesus, both are clearly active participants in Christian service. The episode involving Apollos demonstrates that Priscilla was involved in providing theological instruction alongside her husband. Some scholars therefore suggest that her name occasionally appears first because she held a particularly prominent role within certain ministry settings. This interpretation has the advantage of being connected to evidence actually present in the text. Even so, caution remains necessary. The New Testament never explicitly states that Priscilla held greater authority than Aquila, nor does it provide detailed descriptions of their individual responsibilities. The sources simply do not contain enough information to support strong conclusions about organizational roles. A third possibility is literary rather than social. Ancient authors sometimes varied the order of names for stylistic reasons, rhetorical emphasis, or contextual considerations. Luke and Paul may have arranged the names differently depending on the situation being discussed. Some scholars argue that modern readers occasionally place more significance on such details than ancient audiences would have done. This perspective serves as a useful reminder that not every textual variation necessarily carries deep symbolic meaning. At the same time, the repeated appearance of Priscilla first in several important passages suggests that the phenomenon is at least worthy of consideration. Whatever explanation one prefers, the broader historical significance lies elsewhere. The very existence of this discussion tells us something important about Priscilla herself. She was remembered in a world where countless individuals passed through history without leaving any trace in the surviving sources. Priscilla appears often enough to attract attention from both ancient writers and modern scholars. Her presence is visible in key moments of the narrative. She appears in Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome. She is associated with Paul, Apollos, and multiple Christian communities. Her role is sufficiently prominent that questions about her position continue to be debated nearly 2,000 years later. That alone suggests she was not a peripheral figure within the circles that preserved these traditions. The discussion also provides insight into the nature of historical interpretation. One of the challenges faced by historians of early Christianity is that the available evidence is often limited. Scholars frequently work with brief references, fragmented information, and incomplete records. As a result, careful analysis requires balancing curiosity with restraint. It is tempting to fill every gap with confident conclusions, but responsible scholarship recognizes the difference between what can be known and what can only be suggested. The question of why Priscilla's name appears first in certain passages illustrates this principle perfectly. The evidence points towards significance, yet the precise explanation remains uncertain. In many ways, that uncertainty is part of the story itself. The New Testament preserves enough information to reveal that Priscilla played an important role in the life of the early church, but it does not provide a detailed biography explaining every aspect of her contribution. Instead, her significance emerges indirectly through the relationships she maintained, the communities she served, and the influence she exercised alongside Aquila. The focus of the narrative never rests on personal status. It remains centered on faithful participation in the mission of the gospel. That emphasis becomes even more apparent in the next stage of their story. Whatever prominence Priscilla may have possessed, neither she nor Aquila used their position for personal recognition. Instead, they devoted their resources to strengthening Christian communities. One of the clearest expressions of that commitment can be found not in a public ministry setting, but within the walls of their own home. There, in an age before church buildings existed, they would help create one of the most important institutions of early Christianity, the house church. By the time Priscilla and Aquila appear in the later stages of the New Testament narrative, a clear pattern has emerged. Wherever they go, they contribute to the growth and stability of Christian communities. They worked alongside Paul in Corinth. They helped instruct Apollos in Ephesus. They earned the trust of some of the most important leaders of the early church. Yet one of their most significant contributions did not involve public teaching, missionary travel, or theological debate. Instead, it involved something much more ordinary. They opened their home. To modern readers, this may sound simple. In the first century, however, It was one of the most important ways believers could support the spread of Christianity. Understanding why requires stepping into a world that looked very different from the one most Christians know today. During the earliest decades of the Christian movement, there were no church buildings dedicated exclusively to Christian worship. The familiar image of a church structure standing at the center of a community belongs to a much later period of history. In the 1st century, Christianity existed as a small and often misunderstood movement scattered across cities and regions of the Roman Empire. Believers gathered wherever space was available. Sometimes they met in rented halls. Sometimes they gathered in outdoor locations. Most commonly, they assembled in private homes. As a result, the household became one of the most important institutions in the development of early Christianity. The New Testament provides several references to churches meeting in homes. This pattern appears in Jerusalem, Corinth, Rome, Colossae, Laodicea, and other locations. Among these examples, the home of Priscilla and Aquila stands out because it appears more than once and in more than one city. In 1 Corinthians 16, Paul sends greetings from Aquila and Priscilla, and from the church that meets in their house. Later, in Romans 16, Paul again refers to the church meeting in their home. These brief references reveal something remarkable. Wherever circumstances allowed, Priscilla and Aquila transformed their household into a gathering place for fellow believers. Their home became part of the infrastructure that supported the growth of the early church. To appreciate the significance of this role, it is important to understand what a house church actually was. Modern readers sometimes imagine a small Bible study group gathering casually in a living room. While there are similarities, the reality was often more substantial. A house church functioned as the primary center of Christian life within a local area. Believers gathered there for worship, prayer, instruction, fellowship, and communal meals. Letters from apostles could be read aloud. New converts could receive teaching. Missionaries traveling between cities could find lodging and support. Questions regarding doctrine and practice could be discussed. In many respects, the house church fulfilled functions as later associated with formal church institutions. The home was not merely a convenient meeting location. It was the heart of the local Christian community. Hosting such gatherings required commitment. Ancient households varied greatly in size and resources, but opening a home to a congregation involved practical challenges. Space had to be available. Guests had to be welcomed. Meals often needed to be prepared. Travel accommodations might be provided for visiting believers. Financial resources could be required to sustain these activities. In addition, the household itself became publicly associated with the Christian movement. This was not always a risk-free decision. During the 1st century, Christians sometimes faced misunderstanding, suspicion, or hostility from surrounding communities. While the degree of danger varied from place to place, hosting believers was more than a gesture of convenience. It represented a visible commitment to the faith. The example of Priscilla and Aquila also reveals something important about leadership in the early church. Modern discussions of leadership often focus on public roles, such as preaching, teaching, or administration. Those functions certainly existed, but the New Testament consistently portrays Christian communities as depending upon many different forms of service. Some individuals traveled as missionaries. Some provided financial support. Others offered hospitality. Together, these contributions allowed local congregations to survive and grow. Priscilla and Aquila demonstrate how hospitality itself could become a strategic ministry. By making their household available, they created a place where relationships could develop, knowledge could be shared, and Christian identity could be strengthened. Their home became a setting where the life of the church could take shape. It is also noteworthy that the biblical evidence suggests this was not an isolated event. The references in 1 Corinthians and Romans indicate that Priscilla and Aquila hosted believers in more than one location, and during different periods of their lives. This consistency suggests that hospitality was not simply an occasional act of generosity. It had become part of the way they understood their role within the Christian movement. As circumstances changed and cities changed, their commitment remained the same, whether in Ephesus or Rome. They continued creating space for Christian community to flourish. Historically, this pattern helps explain how Christianity expanded, despite possessing limited resources and no formal institutional structure. The movement grew through networks of households connected by shared beliefs, mutual support, and personal relationships. Before Christianity had buildings, it had homes. Before it had official centers, it had families willing to open their doors. The household of Priscilla and Aquila stands as one of the clearest examples of this reality, preserved in the New Testament. Their contribution reminds us that the growth of the early church depended not only upon missionaries who traveled long distances, but also upon believers who created stable environments where communities could gather and mature. Yet their commitment to the gospel extended beyond hospitality alone. At some point, under circumstances that remain largely hidden from history, their loyalty would be tested in a far more dangerous way. The Apostle Paul would later write that Priscilla and Aquila had risked their own lives for him. It is one of the strongest statements of gratitude found anywhere in his letters. And although the details remain uncertain, it reveals a level of courage that would become one of the defining features of their legacy. As Priscilla and Aquila's story moves forward, we arrive at one of the most intriguing and mysterious statements ever written about them. Unlike the events in Corinth or Ephesus, this moment is not described in detail. No narrative account survives. No location is identified. No sequence of events is provided. Instead, all that remains is a brief comment preserved within one of Paul's letters. Yet, that single comment reveals more about the character of Priscilla and Aquila than almost any other passage in the New Testament. In Romans 16, as Paul sends greetings to various believers, he writes, "Greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well." The statement is remarkable for both what it reveals and what it leaves unexplained. Throughout his ministry, Paul worked alongside many people. His letters mention missionaries, teachers, hosts, messengers, financial supporters, and local leaders scattered across the Roman world. Yet relatively few individuals receive such personal praise. The language Paul uses here immediately signals that Priscilla and Aquila occupied a special place among his trusted co-workers. More importantly, the statement suggests that at some point they became involved in an incident involving genuine danger. The phrase, translated as risked their necks, is a vivid expression. In the ancient world, it conveyed exposure to life-threatening circumstances. Paul was not describing inconvenience, social embarrassment, or minor hardship. He was referring to a situation in which serious injury or death was a realistic possibility. The challenge for historians is that Paul never explains what happened. He writes as though his readers already know the story. As a result, modern readers are left with a conclusion, but not the details that produced it. This absence of information has led to considerable speculation. Over the centuries, scholars have proposed various possibilities. Some have connected the event to Ephesus, where Paul faced significant opposition, and where Acts records a major disturbance associated with the preaching of the gospel. Others have suggested connections to different episodes in Paul's ministry involving threats, arrests, or violent resistance. There are even theories that the incident occurred during an event never recorded in the surviving sources. The difficulty is that none of these proposals can be verified. The New Testament simply does not provide enough evidence to identify the event with confidence. This uncertainty is important because it illustrates a key principle of responsible historical study. Good history requires distinguishing between what the sources actually say and what later readers might imagine. In the case of Priscilla and Aquila, the evidence allows us to state several things with confidence. We know Paul believed they had placed themselves in danger for his sake. We know he remembered the act years later. We know he considered it significant enough to mention publicly. Beyond that, certainty becomes impossible. Yet, even without knowing the exact circumstances, the statement remains extraordinarily revealing to understand why. It helps to consider the broader environment in which early Christianity developed. The first century was not a period of institutional security for the Christian movement. Churches were small, legal protections were limited. Religious disputes could become intense. Local opposition sometimes escalated into violence. Missionaries frequently traveled through unfamiliar regions where social tensions, political concerns, and economic interests could create unexpected dangers. The Book of Acts repeatedly documents such realities. Paul experienced imprisonment, public beatings, hostile crowds, legal hearings, and threats against his life. These experiences were not unusual exceptions. They were recurring features of missionary work during this period. People closely associated with Paul often found themselves exposed to the same risks. Against this backdrop, Paul's statement takes on greater significance. Priscilla and Aquila were not professional missionaries whose entire identity revolved around public ministry. They were craftspeople. They maintained households. They operated within the ordinary structures of daily life. Yet, when circumstances demanded courage, they did not retreat from danger. Whatever occurred, they were willing to place themselves at risk for a fellow believer and for the mission they shared. This observation reveals something important about the nature of commitment within the early church. Faith was not merely a matter of intellectual agreement or private conviction. It involved loyalty expressed through action, sometimes at considerable personal cost. Another detail in Paul's statement deserves careful attention. He writes that not only he, but all the churches of the Gentiles owe them gratitude. This is a striking claim. Paul does not limit the significance of their actions to his own personal well-being. Instead, he suggests that the consequences extended much further. While we should avoid speculation regarding the exact event, the implication is clear. Whatever Priscilla and Aquila did, Paul believed it helped preserve a ministry that had influenced numerous Christian communities across the Roman world. The statement reflects the interconnected nature of the early church. Individual actions often produced consequences that reached far beyond a single city or congregation. One act of courage could affect many lives. The passage also reveals the depth of the relationship between Paul and this couple. Throughout the New Testament, Paul expresses appreciation for many co-workers, but his language regarding Priscilla and Aquila consistently carries a tone of unusual warmth and respect. They had worked together in Corinth. They had shared ministry connections in Ephesus. They had participated in the development of Christian communities across multiple regions. Their partnership was built not merely upon common beliefs, but upon years of shared experience. The reference in Romans suggests that trust had been tested under pressure and proven genuine. In many ways, this brief statement serves as a reminder of how much of early Christian history remains hidden from view. We possess only fragments of the larger story. Countless conversations, decisions, sacrifices, and acts of faithfulness were never recorded. Yet, occasionally, a single sentence allows us to glimpse the depth of those unseen experiences. Paul's words concerning Priscilla and Aquila provide exactly such a glimpse. They reveal a couple whose commitment extended beyond hospitality, teaching, and support. When confronted with danger, they demonstrated courage. When confronted with risk, they remained faithful. And when Paul looked back on the people who had shaped his ministry, they stood among the individuals he remembered with the deepest gratitude. Their actions may be lost to history, but the impression they left on one of Christianity's most influential leaders was profound enough to endure for generations. By the time we reach this stage of Priscilla and Aquila's story, a broader picture begins to emerge. Their lives were not confined to a single city, congregation, or ministry assignment. Instead, they moved through some of the most important urban centers of the Roman world, appearing repeatedly at key points in the expansion of early Christianity. What initially seemed like a series of disconnected events now reveals a larger pattern. Their story provides a unique opportunity to understand how the Christian movement spread across vast distances during the first century. More importantly, it helps explain the role played by the transportation networks, trade routes, and urban connections that linked the Roman Empire together. One of the most remarkable features of the Roman world was its level of connectivity. Although travel remained difficult by modern standards, the empire possessed an extensive system of roads, ports, shipping lanes, and commercial routes that allowed people and information to move across enormous distances. Roman engineers constructed roads connecting major cities and provinces. Merchants traveled regularly between ports throughout the Mediterranean. Government officials carried messages across regions. Soldiers moved between military installations. Goods, ideas, and cultural influences circulated continuously through these networks. Historians often describe the Mediterranean during this period as a highly interconnected environment, and Christianity emerged within that world. The gospel spread not in isolation, but through the same routes that carried commerce, migration, and communication. The journey of Priscilla and Aquila illustrates this reality with remarkable clarity. Their story begins in Rome, the political center of the empire. It continues in Corinth, one of the most important commercial cities in Greece. It then moves to Ephesus, a major urban center in Asia Minor. These were not random locations. Each occupied a strategic position within the wider Mediterranean network. Rome connected provinces across the empire. Corinth linked eastern and western trade routes through its unique geographic location. Ephesus served as a gateway between maritime commerce and inland Asia Minor. The fact that Priscilla and Aquila appear in all three places highlights how closely their lives were connected to the major channels through which Christianity expanded. This observation also helps explain why cities played such an important role in Paul's missionary strategy. Rather than focusing primarily on remote villages, Paul frequently targeted influential urban centers. From those cities, Christian communities could influence surrounding regions through existing economic and social networks. Merchants carried news. Travelers shared ideas. Letters circulated among believers. Local congregations established connections with neighboring communities. In many respects, Christianity grew by making use of infrastructure that already existed within the Roman world. The movement did not create new communication systems from nothing. It traveled along roads, shipping lanes, and commercial routes that connected people long before the first missionaries arrived. Priscilla and Aquila became participants in this process. Their mobility allowed them to contribute to Christian communities across multiple regions, rather than remaining tied to a single location. Another important element of this network involved communication. Modern readers often underestimate the challenge of maintaining connections across large distances in the ancient world. Without printing presses, telephones, or digital technology, information traveled through people. Letters had to be physically carried from one city to another. News often moved slowly. Relationships required intentional effort to maintain. Within this environment, trusted individuals became invaluable. They served as bridges connecting communities separated by geography. A person known and respected in multiple cities could help strengthen cooperation, preserve trust, and facilitate communication between congregations. The New Testament suggests that Priscilla and Aquila occupied precisely this kind of position. They were known to Paul. They were connected to Apollos. They hosted churches. They traveled between major urban centers. Their lives intersected with multiple Christian communities at different stages of development. The evidence may be fragmentary, but it consistently points toward a couple deeply embedded within the relational fabric of the early church. Their significance becomes even more apparent when we consider how Christianity survived and expanded during its earliest decades. The movement possessed no centralized bureaucracy. There were no denominational headquarters, official seminaries, or institutional structures comparable to those that would emerge centuries later. Instead, Christian communities depended heavily upon personal relationships. Trust mattered, hospitality mattered, communication mattered, cooperation mattered. Believers relied upon networks of friends, co-workers, hosts, teachers, and missionaries who shared a common commitment to the gospel. These relationships created a framework through which teaching, encouragement, financial assistance, and practical support could circulate across the empire. Priscilla and Aquila appear repeatedly within that framework. They are not remembered primarily because of a single dramatic event. They are remembered because they consistently contributed to the health and stability of the communities around them. What makes this chapter of their story especially compelling is that it allows us to see the early church from a perspective that is often overlooked. Historical narratives naturally focus on prominent leaders and major turning points, yet large movements depend upon systems of connection operating beneath the surface. The Roman road network allowed travelers to move between cities. Maritime commerce linked distant regions together. Letter carriers maintained communication. Households provided gathering places. Trusted co-workers helped preserve continuity across multiple communities. These elements rarely receive the same attention as public preaching or theological debates, but they were essential to the survival of the Christian movement. Priscilla and Aquila stood at the intersection of many of these realities. Their lives demonstrate how ordinary believers could contribute to something far larger than themselves, simply by remaining faithful within the opportunities available to them. By the end of the first century, Christianity had spread far beyond its origins in Judea. Communities of believers existed across the Mediterranean world. The process was driven by many factors, but one of the most important was the existence of interconnected networks capable of transmitting people, ideas, and relationships across great distances. Priscilla and Aquila were part of that story. Their journey from Rome to Corinth and from Corinth to Ephesus reflects the larger movement of Christianity itself as it expanded through the arteries of the Roman Empire. Understanding their role within those networks helps us appreciate why Paul valued them so highly, and why their names continued to be remembered long after many other details of their lives had faded from history. Yet, the ultimate significance of their story is not found merely in where they traveled or whom they knew. It is found in the lasting legacy they left behind. A legacy that reveals how faithfulness, wisdom, hospitality, and courage can shape history in ways that endure far beyond a single lifetime. As we reach the conclusion of Priscilla and Aquila's story, we are confronted with an interesting historical reality. Compared to many figures in the New Testament, the amount of information preserved about them is remarkably small. They never authored a biblical book. No sermon delivered by either of them survives in the historical record. The New Testament provides only brief references, scattered across Acts and several Pauline letters. Yet, despite this limited evidence, their names have remained part of Christian memory for nearly 2,000 years. That fact alone raises an important question. Why have Priscilla and Aquila continued to matter when so many other individuals from the same period have faded almost entirely from history? The answer lies not in a single dramatic event, but in the cumulative impact of their lives. When the surviving evidence is examined as a whole, a consistent pattern emerges. At nearly every stage of their journey, Priscilla and Aquila contributed to the development, stability, and expansion of the early Christian movement. Their story begins with displacement. Forced to leave Rome under Claudius, they experienced the uncertainty faced by countless migrants throughout history. Yet what initially appeared to be a personal setback ultimately positioned them within some of the most significant developments of the first-century church. In Corinth, they encountered Paul. In Ephesus, they participated in the formation of an influential Christian community. Through their interaction with Apollos, they contributed to the growth of a gifted teacher, who would later become well known among believers. Through their household, they supported local congregations. Through their relationships, they helped strengthen connections across multiple regions of the Roman world. None of these contributions alone fully explains their legacy. Together, however, they reveal why their influence extended far beyond the brief references preserved in Scripture. One of the most striking aspects of their story is the variety of roles they fulfilled. They were immigrants adapting to changing circumstances. They were skilled craftspeople earning a living through their trade. They were hosts who opened their home to fellow believers. They were teachers capable of helping others understand the gospel more fully. They were trusted co-workers of Paul. They were participants in communities stretching from Rome to Ephesus. This diversity of roles challenges modern assumptions about influence within the early church. Historical narratives often focus on highly visible leaders, but the evidence suggests that Christianity depended upon many different forms of service. Missionaries required support. Congregations required meeting places. New believers required instruction. Relationships required maintenance across geographical distances. Priscilla and Aquila contributed in all of these areas. Their lives demonstrate how ordinary forms of faithfulness could produce extraordinary historical consequences. Another important dimension of their legacy involves the partnership they modeled. Throughout the New Testament, they appear together with remarkable consistency. Whether traveling, working, teaching, or hosting gatherings, they function as a team. The biblical sources do not provide a detailed portrait of their marriage, nor do they attempt to turn them into idealized figures. Instead, the narrative simply presents them as a husband and wife whose shared commitment to the gospel shaped the way they lived. In a first-century world where households played a central role in social and economic life, their partnership became a vehicle through which they served the broader Christian community. For this reason, they remain one of the clearest examples of a married couple actively participating in the mission of the early church. Their story also illustrates an important historical principle. The spread of Christianity was not driven solely by formal leadership structures. During the first century, churches possessed limited institutional organization. The movement relied heavily upon networks of relationships, communication, hospitality, and mutual support. Priscilla and Aquila were deeply embedded within those networks. They moved between major urban centers. They maintained connections with influential leaders. They supported local congregations. They helped transmit knowledge and strengthen community life. Their contribution was relational, as much as theological. Understanding this aspect of their story allows us to appreciate how Christianity expanded, despite lacking many of the resources later generations would take for granted. Equally significant is what their story teaches about the limits of historical knowledge, even after examining every available reference. Many questions remain unanswered. We do not know when they first became followers of Jesus. We do not know the details of their conversion. We do not know the circumstances under which they risked their lives for Paul. We do not know when or where they died. These gaps remind us that history is often incomplete. The surviving evidence allows us to reconstruct broad outlines, but not every detail. Yet in some ways, these uncertainties make their story even more compelling. Rather than being remembered for a single spectacular achievement, they are remembered because of a consistent pattern of faithfulness visible across multiple contexts and years. Their significance emerges not from one isolated moment, but from the accumulation of many acts of service, courage, hospitality, and commitment. Perhaps this is why Paul's words about them continue to resonate. When he refers to Priscilla and Aquila as fellow workers in Christ Jesus, he captures the essence of their legacy. They were co-workers, not spectators, not passive observers, not individuals standing at the edge of events. They were active participants in the life of the early church. Wherever opportunities emerged, they contributed. Wherever communities needed support, they served. Wherever relationships required strengthening, they invested themselves. Their impact was measured not by titles or public recognition, but by the tangible ways they helped others flourish. Looking back across their journey, we can trace a path stretching from Rome to Corinth, from Corinth to Ephesus, and from Ephesus into the wider story of early Christianity. Along that path we encounter themes that continue to resonate today: adaptability in times of uncertainty, commitment during periods of change, hospitality toward others, intellectual humility in the pursuit of truth, courage in the face of risk, partnership in service of a larger purpose. These qualities explain why Priscilla and Aquila remain relevant long after the details of their lives have faded from view. Their story is not ultimately about fame, status, or recognition. It is about faithful participation in something larger than themselves, and for that reason, their legacy continues to endure. Long after the roads of the Roman Empire disappeared, long after the house churches of the first century ceased to exist, and long after the generation that knew them personally passed away, the example of Priscilla and Aquila remained. Not because history preserved every detail of their lives, but because the fragments that survived reveal a couple whose faith, service, and commitment helped strengthen a movement that would eventually reach far beyond the world they knew.